My name is Andreas Reumann. I'm the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit here at the Green Climate Fund. Just to say, this is a joint event between the Secretariat of the GCF and the Independent Evaluation Unit to inform colleagues and climate enthusiasts here at COP27 about the second performance review of the GCF. I see. I'm getting instructions. Okay, I should not move too much. I'll do that. So, colleagues, again, just to give you a little bit of a background for the second performance review, this is usually a cyclical review that we do, a performance review of the largest climate fund under the UNFCCC and every 4 years, and it is there to inform the strategic programming cycle of the GCF. We had so far the IRM, the initial resource mobilization period. After that, we are now right now in the GCF 1 period, and we're just about to start the GCF 2 period, the second period of the GCF. And this review, as it says, the second performance review, is obviously a sequence of the first forward-looking performance review, which was undertaken in 2019 and put forward to the board in July of that same year, in 2019, to inform the period 2020 to 2023. This second performance review is going to the board next year, in the first quarter of next year, so towards February of 2023. And again, it's hopefully informing to a large extent the strategic programming cycle from 2024 to 2027 of the GCF. Colleagues, I've got the distinct pleasure to introduce you to two panelists. We thought we'd do a very small panel this morning to get a little bit more of a discussion going. So here on my left, I've got Dr. Archie Rastogi. He's the Evaluation Advisor AI of the Independent Evaluation Unit, so the unit that I currently head. And he's also the task lead for the second performance review, and he will enlighten us in his very brief speech about some of the key findings and conclusions that we have so far. He might also be speaking about some of the products that we've already put forward to continuously inform the fund, including the Secretariat, on some of our findings. On the further left here, I've got with me Selina Reiter from the Office of the Executive Director, and she is the head of policy and strategy here at the GCF. So you see, you've got very senior people to talk to you about strategy, and I'm very well aware that I'm very hopeful that this is going to be very engaging. So before we start, because we're such a small group, maybe can I have a show of hands? Who is here from any other climate fund? Do we have any other climate funds here? I see two hands up there in the back. Okay, these are our friends and colleagues from the Adaptation Fund. Glad to have you. And do we have any civil society here? Oh yes, thank you very much. May I ask you which civil society you represent?
Mercy Corps.
Mercy Corps, excellent, excellent. Thanks, great to have you. And just for you?
I'm an academic from Northwestern University in the States. I study climate finance.
Excellent, excellent. Also some university representatives. That's always good to see. Good morning. So do we have any accredited entities with the GCF in the room? Oh, here we go. May I ask where you're coming from?
We came from JICA, Japan International Corporation Agency.
Glad to have JICA here with us this morning as well. Okay, cool, great. So do we have representatives of governments or representatives of countries? Here we go. May I ask where you're from?
I'm the advisor to the alternate board member from Finland.
Glad to have you. Really pleased. And you?
I'm Tumthon Wongvisuk from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, Lao PDR.
Great to have representatives from Laos as well. So great to have you all. I noticed I haven't come to you. You've never said who you are, so maybe you should just tell us quickly.
I'm a law student at the University of Miami running a law review on Jeff and GCF.
Ooh, that's very exciting. Actually, we're very interested and keen to know what the academia is thinking about the climate funds. And the Mr. here on the left, just to ask you briefly.
Good morning. I am from Lao PDR also, the same with Dr. Tumta. Thank you.
Great to have you. Great to have you. Okay, so we've got a little bit familiar with who we've got in the room. That's great. Hello, there we see Fao as well in the far left corner. That's good to see as well. Good, colleagues. I will now leave the room here for Archie to speak about the second performance review, and then in response to that, we'll hear from the Secretariat, from Selina, representing the Secretariat here on the programming and the strategic programming that we're going to look at in the coming months. Before I do, let me just reassert you in terms of structure. If you're thinking about the GCF and you still haven't got a clear mind of what is the Secretariat, what are independent units, let me just briefly tell you that in terms of structure, oversimplified, one could say the GCF has three parties. It has the board that takes all the relevant decisions, funding decisions as well, policy decisions, and is therefore also the link to the UNFCCC. We've got the Secretariat that is representing the operations and the policy development, in this case here represented by Selina. And we've got the independent units, three independent units that are there for the accountability. So we've got the independent evaluation unit, as you can see here, represented by me and Archie. We've got the independent redress mechanism and the independent integrity unit. So that at large is the entire fund and the structure oversimplified. So now over to you, Archie, for your presentation.
Thank you, Andres. If we can have the slides up, slide set 1. And good morning, everyone. My pleasure to bring to you a preliminary review from the second performance review of the GCF. We launched this. Let me give you a quick background into what this is. So the governing instrument, or basically the constitution of the GCF, provides that there'll be periodic reviews of the performance of the fund. And the purpose of these reviews, as Andres said, is to inform the decision making of the board. So these are essentially done to inform the board in the decisions that the board may take. The board also decided a while ago that the strategic plan of the GCF, the planning that's actually already underway, will be informed, among other things, by the second performance review. So I'm going to call it SPR for the remainder of my intervention. The second performance review stands for the SPR. And with that, the board launched last year the second performance review, the SPR, with the scope was for the SPR to assess the progress made by the GCF in delivering its mandate, the mandate that's set out in the governing instrument, and the mandates and the overall priorities in the previous strategy, the strategy that's actually currently in operation, and to assess the performance of the GCF in promoting a paradigm shift, which is the overall sort of mission of the GCF. We're not yet at the final report. We're only at a preliminary findings, if you will, kind of report, where it's a summary report all ready to inform the strategic planning. We're bringing out next year, when you come to this event, you will have the final report to bring to you. So I'm already making a pitch for one of our events next year. So the summary report that we have presented to the board, and which is out there in the public now, has 5 key areas, and I'm going to walk you through the 5 key areas sequentially, and some areas of recommendation as well. So the first area that we started to look at was the institutional architecture and performance of the GCF, the governance and how the institution is set up. Overall, we're finding that over the course of GCF1, the GCF has evolved a lot, and that's quite positive. There's been a lot of policies that are institutionalized. The USP, the updated strategic plan, was adopted by the board about last year, 2 years ago, exactly. Sorry. Years just run into each other when you're my age, so there's been a lot of achievements in terms of the setting up the institution, even over GCF1, but there are remaining challenges about the slowness of the policy work and the differences in the strategic vision when you speak to different parts of the board and different members of the board who might have different strategic approaches and visions for the GCF. In terms of the culture of the GCF and its governance, we're finding that it's comparable to other multilateral institutions, especially the UNFCCC. Because the GCF was founded in and established in the culture of the UNFCCC, the overall culture of decision making takes after that institution, and therefore resembles that speed and that culture overall. There are many advantages that the governance structure brings. So the board of the GCF has 24 members, 12 developing countries, 12 developed countries. That brings a lot of advantage because it gives the GCF a lot of legitimacy, a lot of credibility, but also has implications for the speed of decision making, because you do need to create consensus before decisions are made. What we're finding is that a lot of the rules for how the decisions get made are prescribed in the governing instrument, and the board has also adopted for itself what's called rules of procedure, which basically gives you a common set of rules with which the board governs itself. But like any other institution, a lot of decision making is also informal. And this we're finding is the understanding of the informal rules is quite different among different members of the board, and that can be a bit of a challenge to the efficiency of decision making. Some of the areas that we're finding for strengthening remain accountability. So accountability of the board to whom? Is it to the constituencies, to the COP, and the accountability of the board to the COP, that can be an area that can be strengthened further. The observer function, where especially the developing country observers and the CSO observers from developing countries and their participation and voice in the board can be strengthened. And gender balance. So the board of the GCF, the governing instrument provides that the board should consider a gender balance, but we're finding that within the board and in the committees of the board, that gender balance can be improved. The responsibilities between the governance and the management structure are sometimes blurred. So what functions and what policies are approved by the board, for instance, or the ones that are approved by the Secretariat, that line is sometimes blurred, and we're finding that can be improved as well. And then the role of the GCF at the level of the countries. The GCF does play a very important role at the level of the countries. It's got the legitimacy, the scale, it's got the diversity of areas in which it can work, and that is all very, very attractive when you look from the perspective of the countries. But its role cannot be overstated. So when the countries look at the GCF, we're finding they see it as a source of finance, but quite distant one. It's not a partner at the country level in the way that it's participating in strategic decision making or planning at the country level, and therefore that role cannot be overstated. It's a very important one, but there are limitations to that role. The second chapter we looked at was access, and we're finding some of the things that we've said before in many of our reports, which is that the GCF over GCF1 has developed a very strong network, a very diverse network of partners. So as of the writing of this report, which was a couple of months ago, the GCF had 113 accredited entities, of which we have at least 2 represented in the room, which is a very diverse set of partners from across different countries, which is fantastic. But we're finding that accreditation function at that time has multiple goals, ranging from capacity building to channeling of finance to changing the portfolio of entities themselves, and numerous other goals. And many of these goals have tensions between them. The alternatives to accreditation are also yet underexplored. So one could partner with the GCF as a readiness partner or as an implementing entity for a project, and those alternatives are yet underexplored at the time of writing. Overall, this relates to we're finding a gap in the vision and strategy for a network of AEs. What that network should look like, who should the GCF partners be, for what purpose, that we're finding is not yet completely articulated. Direct access is a very strong mandate given to the GCF in the governing instrument, and it remains a very strong emphasis by the board, but the GCF still continues to struggle between different entities. So at the country level, who should they accredit, remains a bit of a challenge to identify. And for entities, the process of accreditation remains a challenge themselves. And related to that, the capacities of the Secretariat to support capacity building, and then the mandate of international entities to support capacity building in direct access entities. That's also a function that's yet to show concrete results. And we can go into more depth in that during the discussion if there's an interest. The perception does remain among entities, the candidate entities, as well as the ones that are accredited, that accreditation is protracted, it's an inefficient process. It's not sufficiently differentiated by the diversity of accredited entities, and it's not yet completely optimized for direct access. And that's a perception we are finding among our interviewees as well. The next thing we looked at was programming. That's our next chapter, where we're finding that the GCF has mandated what's called country programs at the level of the countries and entity work programs at the level of entities. Both these programming initiatives are quite resource intensive, but they've added so far limited value in programming directly. I'm going through a lot of very nebulous ideas here, and we can go into more depth into them if there is an interest during the discussion. The GCF also has an effort for capacity building through the readiness program, the RPSP. It's got very broad scope, and it's quite interesting to countries, especially countries with low capacities, the SIDS and the LDCs. But it needs a clear pathway, and the prioritization of different kinds of activities does need to be clarified. GCF also has different modalities and windows: the simplified approval process, the request for proposal modality, the PPF, the project preparation facility, that's the SAP, the RFP, and the PPF that you see looking at on the slide. But the effectiveness of these is also limited so far. That's one of our findings. Let's come very quickly to the proposal and approval process, the review of FPs by the GCF. The volumes are growing, the pipeline is quite healthy, and we're seeing signs of improvement in the process, and the quality at entry of FPs that are coming to the GCF is showing signs of improving. But the process is still seen quite widely as quite bureaucratic, lengthy, inconsistent, and non-transparent. And that's a perception quite prevalent among AEs and countries alike. The negotiations of funded activity agreements. So after an FP gets approved by the board and the Secretariat and the entity would negotiate the agreement to implement that project. And that negotiation can still quite be lengthy and cumbersome on both sides. And the risk management, the results and risk management strategies are a little bit underdeveloped in the GCF. We're finding that the GCF has stated that it would be a second level due diligence institution, but that's not completely reconciled. The current approach to that is not completely reconciled with the scale and diversity of the GCF operations, which is in over 100 countries through nearly 200 projects with more than 100 entities. The last area that we looked at was results and impacts of GCF investments. So what has been the progress made towards achieving the strategic objectives of the GCF that were laid out in the strategy in the USP, as it's called, the updated strategic plan. So there are many targets that are on track, as we're finding, but there's some targets that are that GCF might be unlikely to meet over this period, which is related specifically to the adaptation allocation. GCF has a mandate to balance adaptation and mitigation finance, and that target is currently off course. And the private sector facility related targets. So the share of projects going through the private sector facility, that target specifically is also currently off track. There's some improvements in the speed and predictability of GCF processes, but that's quite limited as well so far. Now, in terms of the maturity of projects and implementation on ground, we're seeing that there is progress made on implementation, especially projects that were approved in the first period of the GCF. Many of them have, in their first phases, done a lot of implementation on ground related to infrastructure, related to policy, etc. And many of these projects come from the energy portfolio of the GCF. Some of these results are forthcoming during a country case study visits. We're finding signs of implementation, etc. But the results, but there's still poor measurement and reporting of project results so far, because the GCF board did adopt last year an integrated results management framework. It's yet to come into complete operationalization, and the results of that are yet to be accessed. Overall, on the basis of the data stated, self-reported data by the Secretariat and accredited entities, we're finding that for adaptation, GCF might meet 1.2 to 2.3% of the stated costed needs in the NDCs, and about 1.4 to 2.6% of the mitigation needs. But again, this is self-reported data, not verified by independently by the independent evaluation unit. We're looking at 3 questions related to co-finance, gender, indigenous peoples engagement. Overall, there's been progress made in GCF1, but there are limitations on the precision of the results with which GCF can report some of these results, and that's likely going to continue. We're making about 5 areas of recommendations so far, and this will become more precise as we go. By March, we'll bring out the full report. The first we're talking about is the strategy of the GCF. As the GCF goes about planning the strategy for the second period, the GCF2, from the period from 2024 to 2027, it should clarify the strategic positioning of the GCF and the priorities of the GCF, the character that the GCF wants to take, what kind of institution it wants to be, is not quite clear to many stakeholders, especially those that are sitting on the outside. There are decisions and trade-offs that are getting made, especially when you're planning an FP, for instance. There are decisions that are getting made. You're getting told that this project will work, this other project will not work. But what the background for those decisions is not quite clear when you're looking at the GCF from the outside. If that strategic positioning of the GCF in the global climate finance architecture is quite clear, that will help. That'll be quite interesting for the GCF. That's our first recommendation, and that relates to the second recommendation about the role of the GCF. It should clarify its own and the partner's role in the countries. Is it going to be a partner that sits on the table? Is it going to be only a provider of finance? Is it going to be a convening partner? That role could be quite clear within the country and to entities. That will help improve the health of the partnership overall. A third recommendation is a sine qua non. We're recommending improvement of processes to streamline them and to make them fit for purpose, for the purpose that emerges from the first two. Because overall, we're also saying that because of a lack of the strategic ambiguity within which the GCF operates creates operational ambiguities as well. And that leads to this recommendation, which is that the processes should then align with the strategic division of the GCF. In terms of results, we're saying that the GCF can now pivot to a results and a learning orientation, that the institution has now already been 7 years under operation, and it can go from an approvals-based institution to one that's taking into account results and learning. And finally, on governance, we're recommending strengthening governance processes to provide for more effective and efficient leadership, in the sense that there is now an opportunity for the board to take leadership. This will take tough decisions. This will take many compromises that might need to be made on part of board members. But there is an opportunity to set, with the strategic planning of the GCF, to set the GCF on a strategic course that then has implications for climate finance architecture at large and for interventions in developing countries at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Archie, for this interesting and truly exciting work here at the Green Climate Fund, in particular, the Independent Evaluation Unit. This definitely helps us to wake up in the morning. No, it does make us feel a little bit better. Just to again, colleagues, we've heard a lot now. Perhaps there's an opportunity to also kick this back to the audience to see if there's any feedback or any initial thoughts that you may want to share before we then move on to also discuss a little bit on the strategy and the outlook on the strategy that the Secretariat is currently working on. Just to say again, we've been looking at 5 areas, which included, of course, the institutional architecture, and it was very interesting to see the reflections here by by Archie on behalf of the Independent Evaluation Unit to reflect of some of the shortcomings, while also recognizing overall we see strong similarities across different international organizations were not so different, so to speak, but some of the discussions, also political discussions that are happening here at UNFCCC are obviously reflected in the GCF structure as well, in particular the board. It was also interesting to hear a little bit about the role of the GCF and how that might be a deterrent to some of the conversations that the GCF wants to have in the countries, and that's quite interesting. I feel that's quite an interesting story, in particular in relation to so many country representatives here in the audience. Also, the question of partners and the access, so the network of accredited entities, has been an interesting finding that this is there, but we need to find a way of strategizing more. And then, of course, this question of precision in terms of results. The fund is very young. We've all gone through a COVID-19 period, which obviously is also not something that's just gone across the projects and everyone could continue working. There was, of course, some delays with that as well. But it's also about what can we then feed back in terms of results and how precise are these results that we're feeding back. So I wonder, anyone in the audience? Yeah, I'll come over to you. Thank you for breaking the ice, and then over there.
Thank you very much for your very informative presentation. My name is Dastan. I came from Kyrgyzstan. Of course, I don't have questions specifically, but some kind of suggestion, if I may. You mentioned that even though that Green Climate Fund is quite young, but from outsider perspective, by the way, I am the contact point to GCF from my country. From outsider perspective, GCF is so well known currently that even those Bretton Woods institutions are not fitted with GCF expectation from outsiders, because everyone can realize that so-called 100 billion USD are there. Of course, it's not that concretely true, but even though that kind of expectation, and my suggestion would be, of course, try to speed up that process of accessing to finance, please, because huge expectation from outsiders, even from politicians. Everybody now talks about GCF. Where are the GCF funds? Where are the 100 billion USD? That kind of stuff. That's why, please, don't compare yourself with other multinational development bank like World Bank or etc. etc. My suggestion is Green Climate Fund have specific mandate currently, take into account that climate agenda overall. That's why please take that kind of different kind of decision in order to speed up those process of accessing to the grants and other resources from Green Fund. That kind of expectation from outsiders, from developing countries, please take into account this expectation. And we hope that as soon as possible, we will get new result, new formulation, new policies in order to speed up. For example, SAP is one of those examples, but still, SAP also not ideal one, I guess, right? Still, it's required accredited entity, end up with submission and so on, so on. That's why please speed up access from developing countries. That kind of suggestion from my side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much from Kyrgyzstan. This is a brilliant feedback. I come to Musikop just in a bit. There is somebody else.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Dr. Archie. That was a very comprehensive and very well presented set of findings, which I found very useful. I have two questions. So the first relates to the strategic, sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Debbie. I'm the chair of the Adaptation Fund's Technical Evaluation Reference Group, so a sister concern, I guess, of the GCF. My question relates to the strategic positioning of the GCF. And particularly, I think, Archie, you mentioned the adaptation targets were slightly lagging in relation to the rest of the portfolio. How does that sit with the board in terms of strategic direction of resources? Are you inclined, is the board inclined to put resources into things that are performing better, which produce results more visibly and immediately and quickly, because we have the urgency of climate action versus struggling to get things, going where there's perhaps less demand or less results. So that's sort of one question I'd like to understand a bit better. And the second is really related to your last slide on the recommendations, where you talked about a pivot to results and learning. And again, I guess that relates to the first question as well. When you're saying results, are you looking at short-term, medium-term, longer-term results? How do you balance results with evaluation and evidence that comes through? So how are you recommending that to the board? Because that's really huge. With adaptation, particularly where I come from, the results are not always evident in the short term. And with the uncertainty of adaptation, it's very hard to predict, what those outcomes might be. But yet it's about what countries want. So I'd really be interested in your perspectives on both of those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, from the Adaptation Fund. Mercy Corp, here you go.
Hi, also Debbie, but from Mercy Corp. So also interested in adaptation and in the strategic kind of positioning of the GCF, and the communities that we work with are often in kind of fragile states. And we all know the problems of getting adaptation funding to fragile states. So I think the problem is well understood, but interested in what the solutions are and whether GCF is really looking at this as an area or whether it isn't. I think kind of clarity on the strategic aims. Is it really about the big projects in the more middle income countries, or is there space for those what needs to be smaller projects, more riskier projects in more fragile states? We've actually put out a paper just recently on trying to unpick some of those problems of how to do climate financing in fragile states. We all know it's difficult, but there are some options. So really interested in kind of exploring that, seeing if that's in the plan or if it isn't, and talking about it further if it is in the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, again from Mercy Corp. Yeah, a gentleman over there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Edward. I'm from Ghana. We, as strategic as GCF is placed, it behoves on it to actually, partner with entities. And Agricultural Development Bank happened to be, one of the financial institutions in Ghana. It's actually a national institution, which is into, form part of the partnership with. We've been given the no objection by the NDA of Ghana, that's the Ministry of Finance. And we are yet to directly engage with GCF. There is this myth that goes on that GCF, the process is such a rigorous process, getting into the accreditation. I just want to find out, is it intentionally intended to be rigorous, or there is a way? I don't understand how rigorous it is. How is there a solution to make it look less rigorous than the rigorous that it looks? Thank you.
Thank you, Edward from Ghana. Excellent comment and excellent question, actually. Indeed, colleagues. Just as a couple of people have joined us. We've been hearing from the Independent Evaluation Unit from the second performance review, the summary report. The final report will only come next year. We've also got our colleague from the Office of the Executive Director, the Head of Policy and Strategy here. She's going to talk to us a little bit about the strategic planning so far and the process for the new strategic period. If you don't mind, I'll turn it to some responses right now. We keep some of the responses though, and for a further conversation after Selina's presentation, because I think some of these will be addressed during the presentation, and if not, we can definitely return. So, colleagues, bear with me. Here, over to you, Archie, for a brief. If you wanted to pick one or two that you think you wanted to respond to. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Just to be brief, perhaps the one I'll pick on is the accreditation and the process and the legitimacy in the countries, because we're hearing from different developing countries the same thing. The GCF is important, but access is a little bit difficult. When we started the session, there were colleagues from FAO's, no, not FAO, FAO sitting, and JICA were in the room. And when I made the point about access, They nodded quite strongly because they seem to have agreed quite evidently with the findings that we have in the report about access. And that relates to the point that Dastan made also, that GCF's access should improve. I think what we're saying in the report overall is that that there is a strategic ambiguity with which the GCF operates. So the purpose of accreditation from a strategic point is not super clear to us. What accreditation means, why it should be, and its ultimate purpose, whether it's for capacity building of entities like yours, or is it to channel finance through entities like JICA and FAO, who were in the room earlier, whether it's supposed to help you move your climate portfolio or your overall portfolio to be climate positive, whether it's supposed to only be a channel of finance, whether it's supposed to do other things, that's not quite clear. Which is why we're finding that we're not making the claim as explicitly, but that leads to a sense of ambiguity in the operational processes, where Secretariat needs to then create processes that speak at the same time to everything and respond to everything everywhere all at once. And that strategic ambiguity on top leads to operational complexity in operations. And that is a recommendation we're making, that for the board to clarify the purpose of these kinds of processes or of strategies like accreditation. And that would lead to a lot of clarity in operational processes, including accreditation and access.
Excellent, Archie. Excellent point. Reminds me of a very interesting discussion in the office. So we're obviously battling with some of these things ourselves to better understand it. I will not speak any longer here. I will give it over to Selina. You have been waiting for quite some time, Selina. Thank you very much. So we're hearing now with the second presentation from Selina Reiter, the head of policy and strategy. Over to you.
So I think the batteries died already. Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you all for attending and the interest and questions. I will definitely come back to them. I think it might be helpful to run through. I've only got 3 slides because it provides a little bit of history and context, I think, for the answers to some of your questions. But first thing, I have to say thank you to Andreas and Archie and actually the whole IEU team for this exercise, the second performance review. I think you saw the slide there. It is a huge exercise. I know how much effort both the team here and everyone who they've been working with has been putting in over the last year or more, and still another 6 months to go to do this. We take it very seriously at the Secretariat. We always read it with interest. I think there's lots there, interestingly, that aligns with our own understanding of what we see in the fund, what's working, what's not working. But like all good brothers and sisters, I think there's also some things that we might not see 100% eye to eye on. So the slides will just go through a couple of those points. And the first one I wanted to come to is, I guess, just our overall performance and progress. So this is our perspective on how we've gone about delivering the current strategic plan. So at the moment, the GCF has, as of the last board meeting, $11.4 billion committed. The total portfolio value is now actually over $40 billion. And one thing we've actually been very proud of this year, it goes to a bit of the dimension of access, is that we're actually committing the resources we get from our contributors as soon as they come. So at each board meeting, we've basically been programming to the limits of our commitment authority. There is no extra money sitting around in our case. We're waiting for the contributions to come in, and that's why we're also excited about coming into the second replenishment process. As Archie and Andreas have alluded to, one of the very significant things for this programming period is our board actually set some very clear, much clearer targets around direct access. We had the adaptation mitigation balance, but also private sector programming. And this is an area where we've seen good progress this programming period. We've gone actually, I think in the grant equivalent terms, which can be a bit confusing, we've gone from 11 to around 18% direct access. but that actually means that we've done a quarter, so over a quarter of our funding programming through direct access entities within this GCF1 programming period. So that's a significant increase in the share of direct access programming from our first period, and we really want to see that trajectory continue into the future. On the adaptation mitigation, I know the evaluation says we won't make it. We're currently at 49% adaptation, 51% mitigation. We do have one more year of programming to go. So of course the team is working very hard to try to bring through the adaptation projects. Actually, by the number of projects, we have 54% adaptation projects. So slightly more adaptation projects, but because the size tends to be a bit smaller in the funding terms, 49, 51. And then on the private sector side, yes, we had a grant equivalent target of 20%. Again, if we look at the nominal terms, we're actually at about a third of our programming going through the private sector facility, but because of some of the instruments we're using, it's actually not coming through on the grant equivalents. So that funding is going through, and what we've been excited by there is we've actually now got a number of private sector adaptation funding proposals. So I think when we started this period, a lot of people asked, how do you get the private sector involved in adaptation? And now our programming is showing how that can be done, which is fantastic. We've had some very good progress on the results management and portfolio management side. We've moved up from having less than 50% of our portfolio in implementation to now over 80% of our portfolio in implementation. That means the project teams are running on the ground, disbursements are going out to those projects. The other thing we have worked on hard is results management. I know the evaluation has some critical feedback, let's say, on this. The integrated results management framework was adopted by the board, I think a year and a half or so ago. It is actually now in implementation. So the new funding proposals are using that, and we'll see the results come through. It's very exciting because it actually allows us to try and see how we're going on paradigm shift. So not just on the adaptation mitigation results, our tons reduced, our beneficiaries reached, the vulnerable people reached, but actually also calibrating what change we're making to enabling environments, how we're promoting that paradigm shift. So we're excited about that. On the process, we've put here process codification and digitalization, but we can call this actually the efforts towards improving speed and simplicity, and really the access question. And so I'll take your question here. This is an area where we've definitely heard the feedback, and we are doing our utmost to reply. I think you also talked about expectations, and it is very, I think, important to be clear on expectations as well. So we see access through a few dimensions. There's the question of, let me take speed and volume. So as mentioned, we had about $10 billion for this replenishment. We're actually programming about a bit over $2 billion per each year of the replenishment. Now, to put that in the context of the $100 billion goal, we're only 2%. And if you actually look at the scale of developing countries' needs, I think we're something like 0.5% if you look at the NDC needs analysis. So we are only that small share of the overall funding. We're trying to get our funding out as fast as possible, but it's really important that we get replenished, and it's really important that we use that funding to try and move as much other funding as we can toward those developing country ambitions. So that's the speed and volume. In terms of simplicity and harmonization, and I think this is an area where we get a lot of questions, we have taken and are taking a few initiatives in that space. So the first, as you mentioned, is the simplified approval process. This is a more simplified process. It used to be for proposals up to 10 million. It's now extended for proposals up to $25 million. And basically the team back in Songdo is currently working on looking at basically ways we can put together fast tracking proposals. So sort of more common template proposals that entities can then come to relatively easier to move them through our funding proposal process, but also at simplifying the internal steps in the approval process. So that is in implementation. The other component, you talked about accreditation as well. The important decision taken by the board this year was on a project-specific accreditation approach. So we actually have 2 tracks to our partnerships now. That if you want to put in it is a significant amount of effort. I'm not going to kid that it's not a rigorous and time-consuming process, accreditation. But there is a track of accreditation, and those are for the partners that want to work with us on an ongoing basis. And then we now have this project-specific accreditation approach, which is if you're only looking to come to the GCF with a single project, we take the project assessment and the institutional assessment at the same time. So basically, it's possible to bring a project to the fund without going through the institutional assessment process. And this is, again, in implementation now. We're hoping it will become live by April next year. The third particular initiative we're taking, again at the board's request, is revising the strategy for the readiness program. So we know this is an area where we really should be much faster, and we've got to simplify the processes and make that much simpler. So that will come to our next board meeting at the start of next year, is some proposals around actually reforming and streamlining the readiness modalities to improve access to readiness. The other areas we're working is actually on policy harmonization. So we know it's very confusing because different funds actually have different processes. So we're actually working with the GEF on a policy harmonization study to look at ways that our policies and procedures can actually be made more aligned. And we're also looking at ways that we can actually be more aligned with our accredited entities' policies. So sorry, that was a bit longer talking about this slide than I meant to, but I wanted to answer the questions on access at the same time. The final point I'll come to is actually direct access. That is a key dimension of access as well. And this is where I think it's interesting what Archie and the team from IEU have said about strategic positioning and expectations. Because on the one hand, we see direct access, I think our partners see direct access as a very powerful paradigm shift in itself. You know, to actually work with an entity that's in the country to channel financing from GCF to that country, rather than going through the international entities, does create that country ownership, which is what GCF is about. But what we find is actually working with these entities to build the policy capacities to help them understand the way we do climate programming. Yes, it takes time. Just like building GCF has taken time. It takes time for us to get our team together. It takes time for us to write all our procedures and understand and train ourselves in our procedures. And so that's, I think, an important thing to understand. If we see direct access as a capacity building initiative, if we see it as a paradigm shift in institutions, in the way we get finance to developing countries, then we also have to expect that it's not going to be happening straight away. But what I think the expectation is we do have partners that can move fast. So I think what we want to understand from developing countries, what our board will have to consider is strategically, do we prioritize taking that time to build more partners and bring them up to speed from the direct access side? Or do we try to move fast with the partners that we have that are ready to go fast? But that might lead us to work with different kinds of partners. So that's a strategy choice that we face. I think I'll just quickly mention the ongoing areas here. I've already mentioned trade-offs. This will be a very important part of our strategy, actually making those choices between what the fund prioritizes. I'll come to your question on adaptation in a second because I think that's one of them. We know we need to do more work on actually translating the investments we've made in readiness, in national adaptation planning into investment pipeline. That's still at a relatively early stage. We know we have work to do around risk management as well, and I've already mentioned policy harmonization. And of course, for us, the big task over the next year is raising more funds so we can keep doing what we're doing. I'll just quickly touch on this slide because it does give a little bit of context to our institutional journey and the architecture that the IEU team has described. So you'll see here the 3 stages of our journey. And basically, I think one thing it's important for us to go back. We're not a startup anymore, but we're not too old either. So we know we need to mature. We know we need to move into that adult and mature way of doing things. But really, one thing that was quite significant for us in that first period is that we had to build the institution from scratch. So in our IRM 2015 to 2019, you see there, we were really putting all the building blocks in place. We started building all our own policies. We started not having any staff. We didn't borrow our policies from other organizations as some of our sister funds have done. And this was an important part of the governance of the fund, being this new model, bringing in developed and developing countries. And in that period, we really, I guess, worked as a co-financier. We were bringing up projects that were already in the pipelines of our partners. And as you can see, policy frameworks, processes were very emergent. Where we are right now in GCF1, I would call we're getting in alignment. We're aligning the building blocks. So you can see here, this is when we had our updated strategic plan. We've had a lot of the policies really come together and settle down. We've recently adopted accreditation strategy, private sector strategy. We've got strategy underway, which is to set, as a respond to the IEU, to set clearer overall expectations on what the fund will be focusing on and where we'll be prioritizing. And within this period, you can see we've moved more to a co-investor business model. So to an idea that the fund will actually work actively with its partners to look at those ideas, to create climate impact, to generate paradigm shift. Where do we go in the future? That's a very interesting question, and I'm interested to hear all of your views on as well. What I'll just do is quickly flick to the next slide. We do have a separate consultation on this on Monday evening at 6 p.m. So this is how we use all of that lesson into our future strategic plan. But one thing I think both our board and all of our stakeholder consultations have challenged us to do is think, how is GCF contributing to the Paris Agreement? How is GCF contributing to developing countries in DC implementation? And so what we're trying to think through here is firstly, really putting that at the heart of our ambition. So how can GCF be that partner that helps developing countries through the NDC, through the National Adaptation Plan, through the long-term strategy implementation process and building those capacities to do that. And what we see ourselves being able to do, but this again is a choice, is we can be let's call it the patient capacity builder. So we can be there with countries over an extended amount of time to actually step by step put in place those capacities to do investment planning, to do investment programming, to do investment implementation. We also do want to be able to move fast. We want to be able to accelerate the race from the results. We want to be able to catalyze. And so there we need to look at how we work with our partners to actually get the funding flowing to where it's needed. So you can see it's complicated in that we're trying to balance potentially different objectives, and that's the balance the board will be considering and trying to strike as we go forward. Within that, and finally to come to the questions, I think around adaptation programming, and particularly the more, I guess, adaptation reaching those last mile communities, the particularly vulnerable. I think that's, again, yet another part of this programming mix. One of the great challenges for us at the GCF is because we have such a broad mandate, there's often expectation that we do everything. And what we want to do within this strategy is not necessarily to exclude things, but to get a little bit more focused about what we can add value on versus what some of our partners, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, the Multilateral Development Banks, and others can do. So within that strategy, 100%, addressing the urgent vulnerabilities, reaching those communities. Recently, we've had a number of funding proposals that are working into the devolved financing space, into locally led action, will be part of our strategy. We just are yet to see, I think, in the discussions, how that segment of programming may align with other segments of programming. In terms of particularly fragile and conflict-affected states, I think that's not a discussion that GCF has had explicitly yet. There are, as you mentioned, particular challenges associated with that, particular risk considerations in terms of developing the profile. And so that's a conversation that's been flagged in the consultations, but I think we haven't fully played through in terms of the degree of engagement in fragile and conflict-affected states. So that might be a live point of discussion as we go into the strategic plan next year. I'm sorry that went a little longer than expected, but I tried to draw in the answers to some of the questions from the audience along the way, and of course, happy to continue having the conversation. Thanks, Andreas.
Thanks, Selina, and not a problem at all. I think it's been very informative for most here. I see people nodding. I'm just looking through my cheat sheet, and you've managed to address most of the questions we had, of course, from Kyrgyzstan. The focal point asking about access, making the point that we're not an MDB, that we should not try to be one, that expectations are high, and that SUP is not working. We've heard from the Adaptation Fund this question on strategic positioning in adaptation. You mentioned this as well, and there was a question that I would bring back to Archie here when we looked at recommendations pivoting towards learning and results, and how do we see long and short term results in that respect. I think that was one of the questions. We may come to that in a second. We've heard from Mercy Corp with Debbie here about fragile states. We've just alluded to this as now. And we had Ghana with Edward talking about partners and this question of how accreditation is working. And I think we've been reflecting on this a little bit already. So just to see if anyone has any other question to ask the two discussants here, we'd be really happy to hear. And I see there has also been new people joining us and listening to our conversation. Please feel free. We want to make it as interactive as possible. Okay, in the meantime, as you've not raised your hand yet, I might just move it over to Archie, just that one question, and then I'll take the privilege of asking another question. But go ahead, Archie, with the question on results and pivoting towards results and learning. Here you go.
Thanks, Andres. So I'll take Debbie Adaptation Fund. That's the question that you, considering there are two Debbies in that corner. So Debbie, yeah, you asked about whether there's an emphasis on from the board or from the Secretariat that we see whether privileging immediate impact oriented projects over more adaptation like projects. I don't think we've seen that. I think there is a very clear articulation in the governing instrument. There is a specification that the GCF should balance mitigation and adaptation. The board has operationalized that to say that the GCF's investments will be 50-50 between mitigation and adaptation. And that's measured over the course of the GCF. It's also clarified that that would be measured in grant equivalent terms, as Selina said. And we've seen that that metric fluctuate around the 50% mark. It's not been off by more than 3% at any time, I think, and more or less. And I don't think we've seen that emphasis itself become evident in the investments the GCF makes. I can stop here or go on with the other question.
Thank you, Archie. Again, I think also from the perspective of making that recommendation to say pivoting towards results and learning, we see there's a very similar type of discussion at the Secretariat that hints at these different building blocks, as we were discussing just now, seeing the institutional progress, the history of the institution, where we had to look at the building, creating these building blocks, we had to align these building blocks, and now we go into the next step. And for us from the IEU, it's obviously a question of how would one do that, and how would one address that. And most often this is a question of results, to bring clearly out the results, and perhaps through these results initiate some sort of focus on certain areas and focus in certain directions. And the learning component is obviously one that we all need to look at as well, given the GCF is such a large organization. There's obviously huge opportunities for learning. Replication and scale requires learning, and requires learning across different projects and different interventions. And I guess that's where we're seeing the GCF heading as it becomes more mature and a true adult, as you said, Selina. So that's been quite interesting. I wonder if we can tilt the conversation a little bit towards the private sector. We've been talking a lot, and we've been hearing a lot in different pavilions. Just yesterday, I was also asked to present very briefly on private sector considerations of the GCF, and we discussed this very widely there at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So I wonder if colleagues, if you could reflect a little bit on the private sector and the relationship with the private sector here. We've heard also a question in that regard with the private sector entities from our friend Edward here in Ghana. how do you see that filter through in the evaluation, Archie? That would be my first question. And then maybe Selina, if you could highlight a little bit of what the GCF is currently looking at with regards to a more strategic view on private sector. I'll bring it over to you again.
Thanks, Andres. So on the private sector, one of the things that we're saying in the report, and we've said in our previous evaluations as well, relates to the mandate of the GCF. So the mandate of the GCF, specifically when you look at the private sector dimension of it, clarifies that the GCF is going to play a role in mobilizing and catalyzing climate finance, private sector finance. But it also makes mention of small and medium-sized enterprises, the MSMEs, and a particular focus on SIDS and LDCs, the small island states and the least developed countries, the fragile economies. So I think one of the things we were finding in this evaluation and previous ones we've done is that the most effective GCF should clarify whether it wants to be a mobilizing private finance institution or catalyzing. And depending on whether it wants to choose one of those roles, the mobilizing or the catalyzing, it will look like a different institution. So if it chooses to be a catalyzing one, which is what we're recommending, many of the projects might not look like traditional private sector projects. They might actually look like grants. They might look like concessional finance. They might look like public sector projects which create policy change, which then go on to create enabling environments, inviting private sector investments in fragile economies or fragile contexts, or contexts and geographies where private sector would otherwise not go. And that's a recommendation we're making. But overall, the GCF for us needs to clarify its role, which may have become a bit more clearer in the private sector strategy adopted ever since our recommendation.
Well, since you've queued me up, Archie, let me say a few words about the private sector strategy. So it does have 4 pillars. The first is actually around enabling environments for engaging private sector. I think this is one thing we hear both actually from private sector, but also from our developing country colleagues and clients, that, how do I engage the private sector? How do these private sector projects come? How do I actually get engaged through the funding proposal, development, initiation, implementation process? Sometimes it feels like it's happening in another world. So the first pillar of that strategy is how do you actually cultivate that engagement, cultivate the mechanisms within country to have that government, private sector, other stakeholder engagement through the project origination process to actually make sure it's fully sort of developed with the country and the private sector stakeholders. Important part of that as well is, of course, enabling environments. So for private sector investment, policy settings, regulatory settings, etc., can be quite important. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is around innovation. So then we know that the private sector has a great number of entrepreneurs, great number of ideas. So the question being, how do you tap them? There's a lot of innovation, though, that's only happening or captured or making use of in the developed world. So often it doesn't make its way into developing countries. So how do we get that innovation actually coming into developing countries, helping with mitigation action, helping with adaptation action? So there we're actually exploring a number of funding proposals. In fact, I think there was one from GIZ that was showcased last night about how you can actually do incubators, accelerators of basically adaptation, mitigation, innovation. And in this case, it was actually sort of locally led solutions. So locally led, sometimes from Indigenous people, from the communities on the ground. How do you actually get financing to people who are working on the ground to replicate and scale the solutions they're coming up with to mitigation and adaptation problems? The third area where I think a lot of our private sector programming is going is really in the space of de-risking. So I discussed earlier the scale of our financing versus the scale of the need. So it is absolutely critical to us that we can use our financing to get as much of that wider finance that's out there flowing towards developing countries as possible. So the way we do that, the way we're doing it recently, these de-risking transactions, is a blended finance. So we might work, for example, with a national bank, whether a public development bank or a commercial bank, to actually blend our finance into lines of credit that reach smallholder farmers, local MSMEs on things like energy services, agricultural crops, a way to make farming more resilient. So we have a few examples of these projects where we're actually trying to increase that finance for people on the ground to pursue more climate-friendly solutions, ways forward, and the applications that sit around that. The other area where I think the fund is going a little bit more away from the conventional instruments and more towards the risk mitigation instruments is in some of the funds that we're investing in. So we basically put our money in as an anchor investor that tries to attract other private sector investors to a fund that will then scale up financing for whether it's, again, small businesses working in a particular areas or particular adaptation and mitigation solutions. So again, we've got fantastic examples of that. We've got the craft facility. We've got the Global Fund on Coral Reefs, which is actually looking at investing solutions in the blue economy, adaptation and resilience of reefs. There's a subnational fund that's actually looking at action being done at the subnational level, because often municipalities, local governments find it hard to get financing, not having that ballast of being the national government and the national budgeting. And then the final area is actually greening financial systems. So we actually have quite a lot of DAE partners that are public development banks. And one of the critical things for these banks is to understand how is climate change going to impact my investments? How is both the physical risk of climate change and the transition risk going to impact what I'm investing in, and to be able to prepare for that? And so this work around actually greening financial systems, looking at ways to issue, for example, climate green or blue bonds to raise additional money basically for climate solutions. So they're the 4 areas in which the private sector strategy adopted by the board will be pushing the fund, and we at the Secretariat will be working to respond to those.
Excellent, Selina. Very well done. Yeah, there's a follow-up question. I'll move it over to there. No, I'll move it over to you, then to Finland, and then we go to Laos. Yeah.
Just clarification, for those 4 areas still will be available for those private sector who has already accredited, right? Without accreditation, those areas will not be possible to be accessed by private sector. Am I right?
So it's now, as mentioned before, so in the main, yes, our partners are accredited. The additional option that's been created by the fund is this project-specific accreditation approach. So if there is an entity that's looking at a one-off engagement with the fund with a great concept, the idea is that this alternative pathway to accreditation would allow that entity to bring the project, and then basically have the project and its institutional capacity assessed in one go. So that is also possible from the private sector side.
Thank you. So I'm from Finland, and Finland is one of the contributors to the GCF, and obviously now considering the GCF2. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about risk management. I don't think Archie mentioned it at all, although it was one of the more concerning findings in your review. And Selina mentioned it, that the work is ongoing, but if you can say a little bit more about that. And then my other point is about results, about the need for some crystallized, I don't want to say simple, but crystallized aggregate results for our politicians who make decisions about funding, because at the moment we find it hard to communicate what the GCF has actually achieved so far, when we only can talk about expected results and expected number of beneficiaries and so on. So if you can comment on that, thank you.
Thank you again. I'll move it over to you, Vilas.
Good morning. Again, I'm from Lao PDR. Actually, I have 2 questions, one specific and one general questions. You mentioned about the challenges in the understanding the country, that understanding accrediting entity that has should be accrediting in this GCF. My question is that does GCF have the strategic plan on capacity building to those countries that, especially if in developing country, in order to ensure that they are understanding the list, for example, the list of accrediting entities? For my general question is that I understand that quite numbers of accrediting entity now submitting concept note to GCF, and I look at the schedule here of GCF. I couldn't see any time slot that you're gonna get updated on that. My question is, do you have plan to get update that to the entity that already submitting the concept note? Thank you.
Thank you again, also from you, from Lars. Those were then 3 questions, if I'm not mistaken. No, Finland and Laos, 2 questions. I'll reflect on this in the following way. So we've got the question on risk management. Perhaps we start with Archie on that one, risk management, and then I like the term crystallized results in results for the political discourse. Archie, over to you. Maybe then after that, right, to Salina.
Thanks, Andres. So, Sai, you're right. The risks, because of the complexity of this presentation and the pressure to keep it under a certain amount of time, I sort of went over it very quickly. But we're saying in the report, for those who might not have read it, that overall the approach of the GCF to risks is not completely clarified. Because the GCF is articulated to be a second-level due diligence partner, but the risk, the approach to risk does not take into account the diversity of projects that the GCF undertakes in the diversity of countries. Specifically, I mean, we might not be able to answer questions such as investment risks and portfolio risk and reputational risk, but at the level of the project, the kinds of risks that the GCF is willing to take and where the liability may lie for risks that the GCF projects may include is not yet clear to us, and we'll address that question more in depth in the final report of the second performance review. But I'll also very quickly address there's an emerging theme about the results of the GCF and how that might be available. We're finding overall that there might be a bit of patience needed with regard to results. While we have, as the IEU, made the pitch that the GCF needs to have stronger emphasis on results, a results management framework, and needs to start delivering, we're also finding that this actually does correspond to the startup life of an institution where results will be a while coming. We have seen signs of implementation. We've seen early expectations of results. At the level of the country, we're finding also that GCF, and this relates to the question by Dastan and also by Edward, that at the level of the country, the GCF does have so many advantages that it's actually almost insubstitutable. It's got the legitimacy of this multilateral institution. It's got the scale and the ticket size that it has. It's the emphasis on country ownership, the emphasis on direct access, and capacity building, and the emphasis on adaptation. All of these are unparalleled, and there's no other institution that has all of those things all at once. And the need for this institution does continue, and therefore, and that's one of the points we'll make also in the final report, and I can go into the roles that the GCF that we might recommend, but more on that a little bit later.
So let me also take the risk question first. I think going back to that institutional journey slide, one important thing to keep in mind is that so we adopted a lot of our policy frameworks, including the risk framework, when we didn't actually have a portfolio. So one of the important things I think we're learning now is that we just need to, it's not necessarily to change all of those policies, but we need to just check the implementation of them in light of our experience up to date. So that's why we're currently just working on looking at that risk appetite statement, looking at the actual risk register, and then certainly internally within the Secretariat, what we're doing is putting in place a risk control self-assessment process. So this is basically where every department engages in a continuous process of actually spotting risks across the operations and then identifying options to mitigate those risks, just to evolve the maturity of that risk framework. The other component I think it will be important for us to have another look at is this question of, in totality, are all of our policies actually lined up with our business model, which is the second level framework? which may at some point, I think, have to come back to the board. But we probably need to do a bit of legwork on that. Just looking at now we've got all of our policies in place, looking at the totality of that, and whether actually from a coherence perspective, it all actually adds up to be pointing us in the right direction. And I mean, there are interesting questions. Debbie, front row, he mentioned before, engagement in fragile and conflict-affected states, and I'm not sure that's something that we specifically countenanced from a risk perspective during that early period. So that would be a question, for example, for looking at our risk appetite statement again. In terms of results, I think I have to echo Archie on the there's an area where some patience will pay off. I think we are seeing now some actual results come through. We are reporting them as alongside the expected results, but you'll see from the degree of our portfolio under implementation that those are still relatively minor in the bigger scheme of things. We are doing a lot more work now on our readiness program results to actually analyze those being shorter term grants, of course, happening over 1 to 2 year period as opposed to the projects over a 5, 10, 15, etc. Year period. And I think one thing that we're very interested in collaborating on as we go forward is, of course, the evaluative component of looking at those results as well. Because the indicators will tell us one part of the story, but actually if we're looking at paradigm shift, if we're looking at transformative change, we're going to have to take that bigger picture view on what the impact is, both in terms of changing country capacities, but also in terms of changing systems for mitigation and adaptation. To the question around sort of the accreditation process, one of the things I think that's come through clearly in our accreditation strategy, and maybe was not so clear in the early stage of accreditation, is the real importance of looking at accreditation with programming. So I think our experience from learning, we've learned the hard way, is that in the first round, many entities were accredited, but didn't really think about programming until after accreditation. And not even with the country thinking about programming till after accreditation. And so this means we have actually many accredited entities who are not programming. So I think what we're really encouraging going forward is if the country has a view of its programming, of what capacities it needs for its programming, then it can find the accredited entities that are best matched to doing that. And then, yes, once that nomination is in and it aligns with the sort of the accreditation requirements for programming, there is capacity building support up in place through the readiness program. At the moment, that again is focused on moving countries to accreditation. What we would like to look at together with our board in the readiness strategy that comes early next year is how do we actually do a direct access window that supports particularly direct access entities more continuously. So as they come through accreditation, we're building capacities to get accredited, to meet policy requirements, but then also continuing to support through the programming process. So there's no gap. So when the entity has a concept note, there's no gap and you have to apply for support again. Or when you have a funding proposal and need PPF, gap and have to support again. So we're looking at basically a way we can make that more seamless. But the key there, just to manage expectations, is it is really important we get those nominations right and that they're aligned with the programming needs coming through for the country. In terms of your final question on specific concept notes, we don't have a session. There's way too many, I think, for us to go through in a session, but would invite you to speak to colleagues at the Secretariat. We have our teams from the country programming, from our programming divisions here. So if you have a specific follow-up, we can definitely take that up bilaterally.
Thank you, Selina. And may I just say thanks for answering all these questions so eloquently. Again, I looked through all my cheat sheet. These were all the questions that were asked so far. I turn again to you, audience. There's one other question here before we close. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not actually the question. I'm the national focal point of Mongolia for GCF, and just taking this opportunity, saying thank you to GCF, especially the funders of the government of Finland. And actually, funders is right to know about the crystallized result. And we have one example, a very solid example. The Mongolia is like Finland. It's a very cold country. We are very much dependent on the coal-fired power plants. And with the GCF funding, we started the renewable energy projects. It's quite successfully implemented in Mongolia with the GCF direct funding. And now almost like 18% of the power energy resources are now transformed. I would say this is very paradigm shift. We are towards this transformative activities. Projects are successfully implemented in Mongolia. At least in the energy sector, we can show you the crystal result. So thank you for supporting us, and we will do much more with your generous support and fundings. Thank you.
Thank you to Mongolia. This was a very enlightening speech at the very end, I must say. Thank you so much. Colleagues, I think we've come to an end. We've asked a lot of questions to our two panelists, our two discussants here. They must be parched and tired at the same time. I see you raising your hand, Archie. Is there another thought that you have? Okay, we'll move it over to Archie once more.
I didn't get to the point that Debbie Mercy COP raised, which was about fragile countries. So we do have findings, Debbie. We've done 2 evaluations specifically looking at the GCF, the effectiveness and efficiency of GCF portfolio in small island countries. And we've done a separate one to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of GCF investments in least developed countries. And the one in least developed countries specifically looks at fragile contexts a bit more closely. And we have currently one ongoing evaluation on the Africa portfolio, which also addresses that question quite head on. One of the things we're finding is also consistent, which is that, at least for adaptation finance, many of these countries have yet to receive GCF finance. At least about 59 of them have yet to receive GCF finance. But this finding is a little bit old. That's the problem with GCF. The minute you state something, it's outdated already. But I'll invite you to read some of those reports and consult some of them, especially the ones that are coming up. And we will talk about the emerging findings of the Africa evaluation next week, and that might be a little bit insightful as well. I also wanted to touch very quickly, Andres, if you might allow, on the question of the role of the GCF, and at least in Mongolia or in Kyrgyzstan, GCF has played a role, and it continues to be relevant for many different reasons, for scale and for legitimacy and direct access. In fact, there was the Prime Minister of Cook Island here on this panel the other day, was talking about concessionality that's imposed by MDBs, and where GCF then plays a role through its concessional finance, which is an important role as well from the perspective of countries. And we're finding that we're recommending that the GCF could play different kinds of roles in different kinds of countries, recognizing their different capacities. And on capacities, Edward raised the point about capacities as well. On this, there's a whole point in our report about the readiness efforts of the GCF and how that could be far more effective, but is quite relevant and welcome. But in the countries without any capacity or without planning, the GCF can play a planning role. In countries with intention but with limited planning, the GCF can support the building of capacities. And in countries with limited resources, GCF can be a provider of finance. And those roles are not necessarily exclusive of each other. It could be the GCF plays this multiple roles in the same country, but there is a requirement to think more strategically about the role the GCF wishes to play, and whether and to continue to play them then in terms of operations of the GCF. But overall, currently, as Selina said it in more diplomatic words, but I'll say it in more accessible words, that the GCF currently is doing everything for everyone all at once. It's got it's got the mandate of a superhero that has all the superpowers all at once, but the resources are not that much. In fact, there's superhero movies that make more than the GCF's portfolio. So we have to be realistic of the resources that the GCF has, and therefore the strategy also needs to play a very important role to figure out what the GCF would do and would not do, and those choices need to be made now, especially as you go into the next strategic plan.
Well, it's always nice to be called a superhero. I guess the expectations are pretty high, right? No, I actually just wanted to say in closing, thank you to you, Andreas and Archie and the IEU. But thank you to everyone here for constantly challenging us to do better and testing us and also testing us on this expectations too, because it is genuinely challenging to carry that weight. And I think the IEU has identified some really important points here about strategic clarity. I think the fund can't do everything. We don't want to do everything. There are many other organizations out there that are also working in climate finance. So it's about actually finding what is it that the GCF can best help developing countries with as we work collectively to implement the NDCs and reach the Paris Agreement. I'll just give one more plug if I can to the, we're having a consultation on our strategic plan on Monday night. So please feel welcome to come to that. And the final thing I wanted to say is thank you to our Mongolian focal point. It's absolutely fantastic. We talked earlier, Archie, you talked about learning and results. It's absolutely fantastic to hear from people, you know, who are experiencing it on the ground, implementing our funding, seeing what that impact is. And I think one of the most powerful things we can actually do in terms of learning is connect our different from different countries to actually share their experiences, share the experiences of accreditation, share the experiences of programming, share the experiences of implementation. So it's actually fantastic to see this happening here today. But thank you all as well once again. Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you, Selina. Thank you, audience. Yeah, with this, we come to a close. As you heard, there are multiple side events here at the pavilion and other pavilions. So I encourage you to look here at the board outside. You will see all the different side events. Come and join us again. The IEU also has a side event here later today. We have multiple side events as well throughout next week. So does the Secretariat. Please join us. Thank you.